All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Janie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Targeted Grazing for Fuel Breaks, presented by Pat Clark with the USDA ARS and Lyndsey Boyer with Carson City Department of Parks, Recreation, and Open Space. This webinar is the fourth in our Fuel Breaks webinar series that runs every week through the end of this month. For details and registration about these webinars, please visit our website at greatbasinfirescience.org. Before I introduce our presenters, I will go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom Webinar as our platform, and its only drawback is that attendees can't see other attendees. So if you would like, please enter your name and affiliation in the chat for a better sense of community on the webinar. But before you do that, please use the two drop-down arrow in your chat box to change the audience of your message from panelists only to panelists and everyone, if you want everyone to see your message. We'll also be using the chat for questions, so please type in your questions at any time, and I will field them to the speakers after the presentations. Now I will welcome our presenters. Pat Clark is a rangeland scientist with the USDA ARS Northwest Watershed Research Center and will discuss a large multi-regional targeted grazing for fuel breaks project. Lyndsey Boyer is an open space manager for the Carson City Department of Parks, Recreation, and Open Space and will discuss fuel break success with sheep grazing and the wildland-urban interface. Thank you both for joining us today. Now I will stop sharing, Pat, and you can share your screen.
All right. Give that a try. Looks like I need to go back out just real quick here. There we go. All right, are you seeing my screen?
It probably is that, yeah, now we do.
Okay, great. So there'll probably be about a 4-second delay when I switch slides. So let's just get ready for a few pauses. Anyway, thanks very much for that introduction, Janae, and let's get started. And thanks very much for our audience who's tuned in. Today, I would like to share with you some of the findings from a multi-regional experiment designed to evaluate the efficacy of targeted livestock grazing for creating and maintaining fuel breaks on wildfire-prone annual grass-dominated landscapes in the western U.S. This experiment was developed through the collaborative efforts of the Targeted Grazing team, which has been organized and led by Mike Pellant and Jeff Rose of the VLM to address the fire, fuels, and invasive tasks that were originally identified back in 2015 in the Secretarial Order 3336. This team is represented by quite a number of agencies and different organizations, federal and state, as well as some private, and is focused on developing, demonstrating, and supporting science-based management. Okay, with that out of the way, so just what is a fuel break and what is a grazed fuel break? Well, they are linear features where livestock grazing is surgically concentrated and strategically applied across fuel-prone landscapes, spanning ownership and administrative boundaries, and to create bands or strips of reduced fine fuels with the intent of breaking up fuel continuity and modifying wildfire behavior. Targeted grazing for fuel breaks thus differs from prescribed grazing, which may be applied in individual pastures or management units during the dormant season to promote ecological restoration of degraded rangelands. So there's obviously a lot of moving parts to coordinate when implementing targeted grazing for fuel break creation and maintenance. However, if targeted grazing proves effective, then this fuel break management approach may yield a lengthy list of potential benefits, including slower fire spread, safer initial attack opportunities for wildland firefighters, constant, consequent reductions in wildfire size and suppression costs, minimize wildfire threat to critical resources such as greater sage-grouse habitat, wildland-urban interface, and restoration herbaceous or restoration and rehabilitation project areas. It also would potentially conserve livestock and wildlife forage supplies and ultimately enhance the resource health of some of these degraded landscapes. Research is needed, however. Management of fine fuels with targeted livestock grazing currently lacks a broad and rigorous scientific foundation. Previous research has largely been limited to plot scale work and case studies, and certainly these contributions are highly valuable, but they do not adequately inform fuel management and policy making. Rigorous tests at scale are needed to evaluate targeted grazing and provide a broad and firm scientific foundation for its use in fire and fuels management. The multi-regional targeted grazing experiment was developed to address these research gaps by providing rigorous tests of the efficacy of targeted grazing for creating and maintaining fuel breaks. The research is being conducted at a broad scale commensurate with the multi-regional scope of the annual grass wildfire problem. The experiment currently consists of 3 targeted grazing projects, one each in Oregon, Idaho, and Nevada, as you can see with the red dots. Fuel break treatments are there at each of these project sites are then replicated in 3 different study areas at each project site. These treatments have been implemented since 2018 and 19 at Nevada and Idaho sites respectively. The Oregon site will be receiving its first set of targeted grazing treatments this year in 2021. Previous 2 years have been spent collecting background data to make sure that treatment and control sites associated with each fuel break are well paired. The experiment is funded by the National Office of the BLM under a 5-year interagency agreement with USDA Agricultural Research Service, or ARS, where I work in Boise. The funding is being supplied in phased installments, and we are adding new project sites incrementally as the experiment progresses. The pink dot shown on the map here represents a potential project site in Dinosaur National Monument in Utah that we're currently working with the National Park Service to develop. We are also looking for additional potential project sites in Washington State as well as in Utah and other states around the Great Basin and nearby regions. But ultimately, we would intend to implement the experiment on at least 5 project sites total across the multi-regional scope of this entire project. Thanks. So the principal goals for each of these projects within the broader experiment are to, 1, strategically apply beef cattle grazing in the spring to create strips or bands or reduce fine fuel loading, and 2, surgically concentrate cattle to reduce fuel continuity, and 3, then maintain these fuel reductions up to the start of the fire season, which is typically the 1st of July in the Great Basin region. Targeted grazing in the dormant season may also be used in some cases to reduce abnormally heavy loads of senesced and residual fuels in the fall prior to a spring grazing treatment, such that that spring grazing treatment can be applied more effectively with less carryover fuels confounding cattle use. In both the dormant season and the spring, targeted grazing is focused in the fuel break rather than just pasture or area wide. So there's a real concentrated use in that fuel break. So in terms of monitoring just how well we're doing with grazing, and that is really the key of this multi-regional experiment, we're monitoring quite a number of responses. Basically, those responses fall into 2 categories. How, and those are measuring the pre and post grazing fuel heights and fuel continuity or canopy gap size, and fuel load to allow us to assess whether the treatment goals or targets are being attained. So in a treatment attainment category of response. And then in terms of ecosystem response, we're measuring herbaceous production, a number of different cover measures, bare ground, basal gap size, and species richness and abundance, as well as effects on soil stability, which allow us to better understand how the concentrated cattle use may be impacting the rangeland ecosystem, such that we're aware and can avoid further degradation of those sites. With all these measures, we're contrasting the measurements that are done in the fuel break with those done in paired control areas that are paired based on ecological site, soils, and slope and such. So they're well paired, and we also collect data for at least 1 year prior to treatment to make sure that treatment and control areas are in fact well paired before treatments are applied. These sampling methods and protocols that we're using could be considered enhanced AIM, which is the BLM's assessment, inventory, and monitoring protocol set. And let's see. Okay, so here are some preliminary results from the experiment. First from the Idaho site near Boise, and then from the Elko, Nevada project site. Note that pre-treatment data or background data were collected in 2020, as I mentioned earlier, at the Oregon project site. But for the interest of time, I'm not going to present those background data, just treatment data from these other 2 sites. So targeted grazing reduced the cheatgrass and herbaceous fuel height at most or all of the 3 study areas at the Boise, Idaho project site in 2019 and 2020. However, the 2-inch stubble height target for this site was not attained by grazing during either one of those years. Cheatgrass and total herbaceous fuel loads were also reduced by targeted grazing. And targeted grazing did not produce any significant reductions in fuel continuity in either 2019 or 2020. So regarding total herbaceous fuel heights, here's some data for those who want to look at some numbers. At the Boise, Idaho site, we saw significant reductions at all 3 study areas in 2019 and 2 of the 3 study areas in 2020, the exception being the hard trigger study area site that's circled here, where fuel height was actually a bit taller in the fuel break than it was in the pair control. And that's largely, well, almost entirely because the operator only grazed there for about 7 days and essentially left the fuel break just too early, just jumped the gun. And so did not get the kind of fuel reductions we were hoping to see, while the other 2 operators did a better job with the other study areas. In terms of reduction of fuel loads, total herbaceous fuel loads were reduced by target grazing in 2 of the 3 study areas in 2020. There was not a significant reduction at any individual site in 2019, but there was a significant overall effect in terms of reduction of fuel loads across all 3 sites in 2019. For the most part, the ecosystem responses that we've measured were similar between treatment and the paired control areas. However, there were some differences in cover for some species, mainly in 2019. As might be expected, litter cover was higher in the control areas, while more bare ground occurred in the targeted grazing areas. Moving on to the Elko project site. We also found that cheatgrass and herbaceous fuel heights were reduced compared to the paired controls, but the 2-inch stubble height was not reached here either. Target grazing reduced fuel continuity, but only in 2020. Fuel loads were similar between the fuel breaks and the paired controls, so there was no effect there. There are some abnormally heavy residual fuels that carried over from the 2018 and 2019 seasons, mainly due to moisture inputs and some challenges of getting targeted grazing on the ground in 18. And so there was a need to apply some targeted grazing in the fall of 19 after the growing season to attempt to reduce the carryover fuels. And this went fairly successfully, as this photo shows, where significantly reduced those residual fuels in preparation for grazing in 2020. So here we're looking at the results for spring targeted grazing on the total herbaceous fuel heights. While there were significant reductions in the height in one of the 3 study areas in 2019, and that being this TS Ranch over here on the left. And this was largely due to that carryover fuel effect. Once we got that squared away by the fall grazing, then all 3 of the study areas, Elko study areas, showed significant reductions in fuel height in 2020. While an increase in canopy gap size and thus a decrease in fuel continuity was observed, it was only in 1 study area and only in 2020. We suspect that the canopy gap size method we're using, which is a standard protocol that Jeff Herrick put together, may not be providing the most accurate or complete reflection of fuel conditions under this application. And that's perhaps a topic for the Q&A session for this webinar, is how best to measure fuel continuity. So I'll leave it there for the time being. So some key findings in terms of ecosystem response. Some differences were observed, but these are mainly limited to 2020. It's interesting that more plant species were detected in the fuel breaks than in the control areas. And looking through that species list, it doesn't seem to be a manifestation of more noxious weeds or weedy species showing up in the targeted grazing areas. So that's good news there. Total production, cheatgrass production, basal gap size, and species abundance responses were all similar between treatment and control. Okay, so what do all these numbers mean, particularly in terms of reducing wildfire risk and damage? Here are two targeted grazing successes that are documented at the Elko, Nevada project site in 2018 and 2020. The Boulder Creek fire was started by lightning in July of 2018 and burned into the fuel break on the TS Ranch site, or study area. It was held along a 2-track road that's shown in the picture on the lower left. And the wildland firefighters held that fire to just 1,029 acres. And discussions with those folks was pretty strong evidence that the targeted grazing, reduction of fine fuels allowed them to get on site and contain this fire at a relatively small size. Again, in 2020, the Bullwire fire was ignited along I-80, the freeway going west from Elko. And again, it burned into this same TS Ranch fuel break and was held to just 64 acres, despite the fire occurring in a mixed shrub annual grass fuel load. So again, the benefit of reducing those herbaceous fuels seem to help firefighters, one, get on site in a timely manner, and two, hold the fire to a relatively small size. So just 2 slides left. So we're finding that targeted grazing in the spring can be effective, but also quite challenging. Flexibility is required. Intensive livestock grazing in the spring requires very careful and flexible management. You're grazing in a time when plants are vulnerable, not just cheatgrass, but other plants that we may not want to harm. And it's also difficult to get out in the field and sync the grazing, timing of your grazing with the phenological timing of cheatgrass growth. The simple forage supply within the fuel break, and then that rapidly changing palatability of cheatgrass that requires just a great deal of flexibility. And both the ranchers supplying the grazing livestock and the agencies administrating grazing permits and the guidelines and the authorizations all must be flexible. And this flexibility includes having provisions to apply dormant season grazing as the need arises, in addition to spring grazing. And last slide, I'll close with a few take-homes about targeted grazing for fuel breaks. As I just said, targeted grazing in the spring can reduce fuel height, load, and continuity. And these reductions may be large enough to moderate fire behavior and assist in fire containment. Furthermore, when Carefully applied, targeted grazing can effectively manage fuels without causing further degradation to annual grass-dominated rangelands. Considerable flexibility on the part of cooperating ranchers and agency managers is required, however. And spring grazing may need to be preceded by some fall or dormant season grazing during years of abnormally high residual fuel loading. And finally, a 2-inch stubble height target for grazed fuel breaks may be something we want to reconsider. It may be unrealistic target, and it may simply be the wrong thing to target. And in conversations with fire managers, we're now leaning more towards some sort of a fuel continuity measure as probably the best measure in terms of how effective a fuel break will be. Again, that's a topic for discussion and Q&A, I think. And that's all I have for the time being. Thanks very much for tuning in. And I'll pass the screen back to you, Janae.
Great. Thank you so much, Pat, for that great presentation. If you have questions for Pat, we'll save all the questions till after both presentations, but we have some great ones queued up, and just be sure to type your questions in the chat.
So I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Lyndsey Boyer, and I am the Open Space Manager for Carson City Parks, Recreation, and Open Space. And I'm very excited to chat with you all today about Carson City's grazing management for fuels reduction project using sheep. So just a little background here. There was an initial pilot project looking at fuel reduction using sheep that was implemented in 1999 in Carson City in conjunction with UNR Cooperative Extension. And that was just kind of an idea that they had that they wanted to see if it would work in Carson City. And then about 5 years later, Carson City experienced one of the most devastating wildfires that we've had within our city limits. So in 2004, the Waterfall Fire burned pretty much the entire west side of Carson City. And as you can see in this photo here, it burned directly up to the wildland-urban interface. And unfortunately, 17 homes and structures were lost from this fire. So it was a really devastating event for Carson City. And afterwards, there was a significant multi-agency restoration effort that was put in play. A lot of money went into the ground to try to restore the perennial grass and timber communities that we had on the west side of Carson City. But of course, after any disturbance in Nevada, what we saw come back immediately after the fire was a landscape dominated by cheatgrass and annual mustard. And we did get to see a decent amount of perennial grass recovery as well. So based on that and the successes from the 1999 pilot project, we worked with several different agencies and partners to put together a targeted grazing project using sheep starting in 2006. And we've been implementing the project in kind of various configurations ever since. So some project partners. As I mentioned in the past, that 1999 project was primarily spearheaded by the University of Nevada Cooperative Extension, but we also worked with the Agricultural Research Service as well as the Nevada Department of Ag. And we also worked with Resource Concepts both then and in the past few years to put together the actual grazing plan, prescription, and kind of overview of what the project would look like. So currently the project is primarily managed by Carson City, but we also work closely with the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest, Nevada Division of State Lands, the Washoe tribe of Nevada and California. And our livestock producer is Borda Land and Sheep Company, which is a group that has been running sheep in the Carson City area for many, many years. So here's a map where you can see the project area. As I mentioned, we have lots of different agencies that are involved in this project. The west side of Carson City is a bit of a checkerboard patchwork in terms of land ownership. So the project boundaries cross Carson City ownership, Forest Service, Nevada Division of State Lands, the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California, as well as some private property. So it's a bit of a juggle to make sure that we have proper right of entry permissions from both landowners and all those different agencies. But making that all come together, we create a pretty decent fuel break at the wildland-urban interface throughout Carson City. So some project objectives that were originally identified for this project. The primary one is to reduce the fire hazard in Carson City by reducing biomass through targeted grazing. We focus on cheatgrass primarily, but also perennial grass and invasive annuals such as tumble mustard. The grazing treatments are generally focused within 1,300 feet behind homes to create that fuel break at the wildland-urban interface, but the sheep do travel into other parts of the city as well. We use sheep as a tool to remove up to 80% of the herbaceous biomass. That's kind of the cap that we're willing to remove from the landscape. We'll learn more later, but we never quite get to that 80%. Another objective is to maintain a minimum of a 3-inch stubble height post-grazing. That's primarily for perennial grasses. We want to make sure that we're not overgrazing as a result as well. And the season of use for this project is primarily April 1st through May 31st. So we're targeting cheatgrass when it's in its most palatable stage. So some project specifications. Currently in the last few years, we have been doing a 2-band grazing operation. So as I just mentioned, our grazing duration is from around April 1st to May 31st. So we have 2 bands that focus on different portions of the city. The northern band is out for approximately 4 to 6 weeks. They usually turn out around April 1st, and that band is primarily composed of just ewes. We get about 1,200 in that band. And then the southern band, we have them for a little bit longer. It's a larger project area that they cover. They typically turn out mid-April, and that band is comprised of both ewes and lambs. And we rotate grazing sites every 2 to 4 days. So the sheep are not spending too much time at any one site because, again, we want to avoid issues with overgrazing or potential issues with soil compaction or things like that with just so many sheep hanging out in one area at a time. We also use watering and bedding sites as a way to concentrate grazing intensity at certain areas, and especially at the wildland-urban interface. So we'll learn a little bit more about the watering and how we use that later. So here's just a more detailed map that shows the 2021 grazing rotation. This is the same plan that we used in 2020. We recently worked with Resource Concepts to update our grazing plan, and so this is what was included. But you'll see here we have the group on the north end of town, as well as the group on the south end of town. And then one thing I wanted to call out from this map is there's a couple inserts here that show areas where we use temporary fencing. The temporary fencing is either used to protect certain sensitive areas, whether that's an environmentally sensitive area or a culturally sensitive area, since we are grazing Washoe tribal land. But we also use it to protect the sheep from getting into the streets and in town, since we are concentrating grazing so close at the wildland-urban interface. So temporary fencing is definitely an important aspect to this project. In terms of logistics and support, there is quite a lot of efforting and coordination that goes into making this project operate. So with that many sheep on the landscape, we do
Lyndsey, I don't know if this is the same for everyone, but you just froze for me.
She's
Is that-
frozen for me too.
Lyndsey, you froze.
Uh-oh.
Trailers here. So those are the trailers that the sheep herders will spend their time in, and they are moved from location to location. Other logistics and support aspects to this project. So on the lower left here, you can see there is a fire truck. So working with the Carson City Fire Department, we do have daily watering needs for the sheep. We do have some perennial creeks that are in the project area where the sheep can get water sometimes, but typically we're bringing in water for those sheep. So we have a great cooperation and partnership with Carson City Fire, and they come in with their engines and they water the sheep on a daily basis. And the project would not be able to be successful without the help of the fire department. And then of course, you'll see in this photo here with one of our other helping hands in this project, we do have several border collies that spend 24/7 with the sheep as well. They help keep the sheep in line and move them from location to location. And we also have a couple of guard dogs, generally Great Pyrenees, that spend time with the sheep as well to protect them from predators. So some advantages of using sheep as a tool. I think one of the biggest advantages in this particular project is that sheep focus on herbaceous vegetation. Generally, because of the way that sheep's anatomy work, they tend to clip the grass rather than pull it out at the roots. So that's helpful in that they are grazing perennial grasses as well, and we don't want to damage those root systems. We want the perennial grasses to come back healthy. We're just trying to reduce overall above ground biomass. And then of course with cheatgrass, they just clip it right off there as well. Other advantages of sheep versus other livestock. Sheep have the ability to traverse steep slopes and rocky terrain. So pretty much the whole west side of Carson City is characterized by foothills and some steep slopes. And so sheep are a little bit more willing to traverse some of those hill areas. And then I think the biggest thing with the sheep project is that sheep by nature are, a herd species. And so they're really easy to move around from location to location. And it's also easy to control their movements generally. So we can have them avoid certain sensitive areas that are either environmental or culturally sensitive. And as I mentioned, our on-site herders and herding dogs assist with that. And then also just having such a large flock of sheep, they do trample the vegetation, and that can help with some of the cheatgrass of just kind of weighing it down and disrupting its overall growth. So even if they're not grazing on it directly, just the physical presence of them being there helps out with reduction in cheatgrass as well. So we do extensive monitoring on the project, and we've been doing this monitoring since 2006. So we have a pretty decent data set built up. The monitoring typically consists of utilization monitoring post-grazing. We also look at stubble height and do some measurements related there. We also do photo point monitoring. So we take repeat photos every year so that we can monitor change through time. And we also have several exclusion cages and exclosures that are out on the landscape, and that helps us kind of measure our impact through time as well. So here's an example of our exclusion cages and exclosures. The cage is on the left and one of our exclosures is on the right. Our step counts to measure stubble height and our utilization data are taken pre and post grazing as well as at the end of the growing season. And these cages and exclosures are used as kind of a monitoring location or stepping off point for that monitoring. So I wanted to provide just some year-to-year comparisons since we do have such a long-term data set. So the photo on the left here is from 2006. This was, just a couple years after the Waterfall Fire. So you can see we do have some perennial grass recovery, as well as just some cheatgrass and perhaps some other forbs in the inner spaces. And then on the right here, we have a photo from 2020, same location. So you can see that we have transitioned into a much more of a shrub dominated community with perennial grass in the interspaces. Certainly there's some cheatgrass out there, but you know, it's not the cheatgrass monoculture that it could have been without the intervention of restoration efforts as well as this long-term grazing program. Another year-to-year comparison. So here's a photo from 2007 at a different one of our monitoring locations. You can see just how much perennial grass accumulation there is. There's quite a lot of decadent material and litter that you can see as well. And then on the right, you can see a photo from 2020. Again, we've kind of transitioned to more of the shrub-dominated community with perennial grass in the interspaces. There's certainly a lot more bare ground and a lot less decadent material and litter that's accumulating. And just another year-to-year comparison for you. Photo on the left is also from 2007. Again, you can see just how much accumulation of fuels there are, extensive perennial grass, as well as a lot of cheatgrass litter in the interspaces. And then a photo here on the right from 2020, you can see there's a lot less accumulation of decadent material. The perennial grasses are still healthy and functional. There's also some cheatgrass in the interspaces, but not a whole lot of litter that has accumulated. And I'll note that we have had fires in this particular location before, and we've seen just anecdotally that the fires are much less intense and don't burn nearly as hot as other areas that have not been grazed. So some additional sort of data and results for you. So this photo here is another example of one of our exclosures. And I think this photo really speaks volumes in terms of seeing the grazed versus ungrazed comparison. So this exclosure has been up in Carson City since the inception of the project. So about 15 years of grazing exclusion here, and you can see just how much fuels have been accumulated versus the grazed portion. There's just such a stark difference here. Some interesting fact, an adult ewe can consume about 5 pounds of vegetation per day. So on the north end of town, that north band, we have approximately 1,200 ewes versus the south band, we have about 1,700 total sheep, including the lambs. So when you do some rough calculations based on what both the ewes and the lambs can consume, that brought us to about 158.3 total tons of vegetation removed in 2020. So you can see it's a pretty significant fuel reduction effort on the part of Carson City. And typically we see an average of between 19 and 30% utilization at our sites. It is higher, somewhere around the 40% range at our bedding or watering sites where the sheep are more concentrated. But we're in no ways getting close to that, that cap of 80% that was originally identified for the project. So just some additional data here, did some transects both inside the transect versus, or excuse me, inside the exclosure versus outside. And just kind of some anecdotal observations here. You can see that generally inside the exclosure, there's significantly higher cover of vegetation in general. There's higher litter and perennial grass cover in general, and very little bare ground, versus outside the exclosure in the grazed portion, you'll see there's generally less cover, less litter, more bare ground, and then also I thought was interesting, a higher forb cover, and just kind of general higher diversity in terms of species richness outside of the exclosure versus inside. So some challenges associated with this project. The green up period for cheatgrass and perennial grasses can be somewhat unpredictable. We're not always sure what the production is going to be each year, especially depending on precipitation levels. So there's just a lot of kind of initial monitoring and coordination with the rancher as we decide when we're going to turn the sheep out. So it's not always on the same date every year. It just kind of depends on the environmental and vegetative conditions of that year. Another challenge is that it can be difficult to provide an adequate fuel break within the entire project area because the whole project area is about 6,500 acres. So it can be challenging to cover that entire region. Again, we are focusing right at the wildland-urban interface, so we never cover those total 6,500 acres. But using the 2-band system, as we've been doing the last 2 years, we've seen greater success in terms of just getting more coverage and more effective grazing across the city using these 2 different bands. In the past, we would just have 1 band trying to cover that entire project area. And by the time they got to the north end of town, we just were outside of that palatability range for the sheep. Another challenge that has arisen is some sensitivity regarding watershed management. So the west side of Carson City, the watershed there also does provide the drinking water for Carson City. And so there are some concerns about, mixing grazing with a watershed protection zone. And so we have identified some exclusion zones where we don't allow the sheep to graze. And those are primarily in the area around our water treatment facility, as well as the creeks that specifically feed the drinking water system. We do also use temporary fencing to help, as I mentioned, exclude the sheep from certain areas as well. There's also an issue with a buildup of woody fuels at the wildland-urban interface. So since we've been targeting herbaceous vegetation so much, we are seeing the need for doing some woody fuel reduction as well. So we've done mastication and worked with the fire department to mitigate that also. Just quickly wanted to mention that, Carson City is very on board with this project, and that's incredibly important to making this project a success. So you can see here just the media response related to the sheep project over the years. Obviously, the reporters in Carson City are extremely punny. So this is a collection of some of my favorite headlines through the years. But every year I receive so many calls from both the media and the community just wondering when the sheep will come back. And it does take the community to buy into this project because there can be conflicts with dogs and recreation. And so we need everyone in the community to be on board and supportive of the project as well. Some additional notes here just along the lines again of community support. Here is a photo of me on the right leading an interpretive hike related to the sheep program, and about 70 people showed up to that project or to that program. This is before COVID, of course, but you can just see how much interest there is from the community, which we really appreciate. And then this headline here, I thought was really funny: neighbors forced to help as massive herd of sheep invade street in Nevada. That was actually a headline that ended up on a news source coming out of the UK. So we've certainly received some global recognition for our project. And that was a day where the sheep were not attended, and they ended up invading a neighborhood, and all the neighbors had to get out and try to get them back on track. So we just appreciate how much buy-in there is in Carson City and how successful that's been for making the project effective overall. So with that, my information is here if anyone has follow-up questions. Please feel free to reach out to me, but I will turn it back over to Janae for our Q&A session.
Great, thank you so much, Lyndsey. Just because it kind of addresses maybe the challenges you were just talking about, and then I'll scroll back up to the top of the questions, but can you briefly talk to this comment that one disadvantage of sheep versus cattle is the risk of disease transmission to wild sheep?
Oh, that's a great comment, and there certainly is that risk. And I guess for us here in Carson City, we've been lucky in that, or I shouldn't say lucky, but there isn't a whole huge population or a population at all of wild bighorn sheep. So that's just not a concern that we have specifically. But I know in certain other parts of the state, that would certainly be a concern.
Great, thanks. All right, getting back up to the top of the questions. These are for you, Pat. How are cattle contained within the fuel breaks? How many AUMs per fuel break? And did AUMs differ by ecological site?
Well, as you can imagine, there's some variability across the different project areas, so it's difficult to answer a specific AUM question there. The intent there is to stock at a higher level than would normally be stocked on their permit, or at least concentrate use. So AUMs per acre or animal units per acre would certainly be higher than on the rest of the allotment permit. What was the other part of the question? I'm sorry.
How are cattle contained within the fuel break?
Yeah, thank you. And that varies a bit too. To put in fencing or permanent fencing or temporary fencing generally requires the EA process to go through. And some locations have chosen to pursue that route, and others, I think, have taken a more practical view of that and have attempted to hold cattle on the sites using water supplement and active herding. And that's the case primarily at the Boise site, where that is all pretty much active herding and water supplementation. At Elko, it's a little bit of a mix. Two of the sites are fenced. One was originally fenced, and then the fence came down for other reasons, and so there's some active herding going on in that third site. The Oregon site will all be active herding and watering. And I think if you take the long view on the application of targeted grazing for fuel break creation, although you probably don't get as a clean treatment effect as you would with fencing, it's probably more logical to use the watering and the active herding as a way to create the fuel breaks. Simply easier to get through the EA process, and also it's going to be a considerably cheaper proposition to do that.
Great, thank you. Next question was, were the photos taken directly after grazing or during the July-September fire seasons? Was that the difference in precipitation in Nevada between the 2018-19 season versus the 2019-20 season?
Not quite sure which particular photo they're talking about. Most of the after photos were taken at the time of the either right at the start of the fire season or within the fire season, and the pre-treatment photos were taken just prior to grazing.
Great, thank you. Could you clarify what you mean, Pat, by dormant season grazing? Is it just outside the spring window?
There's quite a number of papers out there, quite a bit of research on dormant season grazing, and it's generally related to the dormancy of the species that you're grazing, or just the dormant season of herbaceous material in general. So it's generally, it depends on the year, but I would say October through say February before our growth starts up again. But again, it depends on the year and the season and temperatures and things. But starts in kind of mid to late fall and then ends in the late winter.
Great, thank you. Could you expand on what species you were seeing in the targeted grazing sites compared to the controls? What were these native grasses, forbs, etc.?
There's certainly a lot of annuals, annual mustards. As noted, there's Russian thistle and a lot of the ruderal species that you would expect to show up in kind of a degraded system. There's certainly, in most cases, there were perennial bunch grasses, native bunch grasses, as well as where there was seeding going on. There was some crested wheatgrass and some residual shrubs, big sagebrush, horsebrush, and things like that are in there. One thing we were really watching out for was whether we were opening the door for noxious weeds to come in as a response to the grazing, and so far that's not really been the case. We're not seeing a change in those systems, and generally if there was noxious weeds in those systems, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to start out the grazing anyway. You need to control those noxious weeds first. So.
Great, thank you. Let's see, you had mentioned in the summary that grazing reduced continuity, but that was only true at one site in 1 year. Since the key reason cheatgrass contributes to large and frequent fires is the formation of continuous fuels. It looked like also from one of your slides that fuel loads didn't differ in Nevada. So could you clarify why the grazing was considered successful?
Well, that gets to the point that I raised about the continuity. I think we've got two things going on there. We're probably using the Jeff Herrick method of canopy gap method for continuity. Needs some tweaking, or we may require a different approach to measure continuity. As we are certainly seeing some changes just visually looking at it, seeing more bare ground patches and things. And so there are a number of factors involved in doing canopy gap that may need some adjustment, whether it's the gaps, minimum gap size, or it may make sense to take an entirely different approach to this particular application, such as using UAV and drone imagery and classification of bare ground. May make more sense that way. And I know as fire managers talk to me about it, it's when they walk through a fuel break, that's what they're looking for, is how much bare ground can they see between plants as they walk through. And so you would think that canopy gap might get at that, but it, not the way we're applying it doesn't seem to be. So in terms of the fuel load differences, that particular case is really because of the carryover fuels that essentially carried over from the heavy snowfall year we had in 17, which produced a lot of fuels in 18, and then not getting good treatment in 18 carried over to 19. And so hence the need for some fall grazing in fall of 19. And with that fall grazing in 19, then we did see reductions in fuel height, fuel loading, and in one case the fuel continuities. So it's an art as well as a science, certainly, in putting these things on the ground, and a lot of this is learned by doing. So we're in fact conducting science as we do that. So hope that answers all the questions.
Great, thanks. Lyndsey, the next one's for you. Looking at your cheatgrass data for Sea Hill, there doesn't appear to be a difference between in and outside of the exclosure. It didn't look like there was a lot of difference in litter either. What do you contribute the difference in fire behavior to?
Good question. I think visual observations versus what the more quantitative data tells us. You can see in that photo that there's certainly a larger amount of litter and just perennial grass coverage in general. Sea Hill as a particular site isn't overly dominated with cheatgrass. It has a lot more of a perennial grass cover. So I think at that particular site, that is what we're looking to just overall reduce at the wildland-urban interface, since it does directly abut homes. So I think, throughout our different sites, they're so diverse in that some are more cheatgrass dominated or invasive annual dominated than others versus the perennial grass dominant. So I guess that would be the primary difference in fire behavior. We haven't had a fire in that particular location, but I think if we did, we would see that it would be much less significant in other areas just because of the increased amount of bare ground and just overall less cover.
Great, thank you so much. Well, it looks like that was the last question. So great questions, everyone, and great responses and discussion. Thank you so much. We would greatly appreciate it, attendees, if you take our 3-question survey that will appear after I close the webinar. And the recording will be posted on our Great Basin Fire Science YouTube channel, which, because that was too long for YouTube, it's called GB Fire Science. But we'll send you the link through the automatic Zoom follow-up email that you'll get tomorrow. And if you have further questions, please email or call me anytime. And you can also get in contact with the presenters as well. Thank you all for attending this webinar. And thank you so much, Pat and Lyndsey, for presenting. Really appreciate it.
Happy to.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Have a good day.